Yeah, pretty low turnout. And yeah, just one caveat, quick shout out. This next chapter is pretty loaded with political opinions. So I'd actually not want too much opinions. Maybe I don't know, but we can keep this an open discussion. We'll just wait 1 minute if somebody is joining. This is a pretty low turnout for today, and all of us already know each other. So yep. So we'll start. We were at this paragraph. I'll just read the last paragraph. We had discussed the prisoner's dilemma, which in a nutshell is the choice between whether to cooperate or to defect. And cooperation in that specific dilemma results in a better outcome. But the cost is that when you are not in a position where you have no information about somebody, whether they'll cooperate or not, the suboptimal route, which is to not cooperate, which is to defect, leads to a more better outcome, because the cost is that if you are cooperating and the other person is not, then you receive a much harsher sentence. So this is me generalizing the prisoner's dilemma. This applies to a lot of human decision making. And the lesson is there is more complex game theory behind it. Ravi and I had a discussion around it, that game theory is a mathematical framework around studying human psychology and decision making. So it is a very interesting field, which I think, like how economics does not really go into the inside of how a human mind works. It has more to do with the exchange that humans do in a market. So it has nothing to do with human psychology. Human psychology is purely got to do with human mind, about how human mind operates as a system, whether that's through human brain, neuroscience, whether through human relationships. And game theory is like that very neat intersection of both of them. It can be a separate field, but if somebody were to categorize these fields of study, then game theory is somewhere between psychology and economics, where it is at the intersection of human mind and human decision making, which is more tangible. You can measure those decisions, and it is a more mathematical framework. So this chapter actually also compares how Ludwig von Mises and Rothbard were critical of game theory, because it positions human behavior in a very mathematical model, which is debatable, which is right or wrong. But this is their opinion on understanding human behavior more from a purposeful action framework. And we wouldn't get too much into the debate of game theory and whether or not it applies on economics. But I think it's good to at least understand that it's still up for debate within the Austrian economics school whether mathematical modeling even applies to human action. And yeah, so just that background on understanding what this is. And the second chapter today, the chapter that will start, will finish off incentives within this chapter, and just I'll try to summarize what this book positions, and then we'll open for discussions. And the second chapter, wokeism, is a pretty loaded chapter. It is interesting nonetheless, because it is the reality of how the world is operating currently. So feel free to share any opinions, and just a caveat that none of these opinions are Brichala's opinions, or some of my personal opinions. I'll share them, but we'll try to have a healthy debate if somebody is interested in that. I've almost interacted with everybody here, so there's no strong political disagreements that we'll have. Okay, I'll start reading. With its option to cooperate or defect, the prisoner's dilemma mirrors real-world conflicts and natural phenomena, illustrating how repeated interactions impact strategic choices. A 1980 computer tournament organized by political scientist Robert Axelrod brought new insights into the dilemma by letting players play it repeatedly using various strategies. As it turns out, the game is played in perpetuity. When the game is played in perpetuity or some unknown number of times, the winning tactic is a strategy called tit for tat. Just quickly checking, Ravi and Dhruv will also join. Thank you guys for joining. I hope when I was giving the context, you guys joined. And yeah, just stressing on the fact that prisoner's dilemma applies to a very isolated case where both the participants of the experiment know nothing about each other. They have no reason to cooperate. So their best rational decision will be to not cooperate or to defect, because they have zero information about the other person. But as we interact more with people, there is more information about their behavior, their personality, their character. So you can contemplate on the possibility of cooperating. So this changes game's dynamics, because now there is some benefit to cooperate with another human. And yeah, so tit for tat has so there's a Veritasum video on this as well, that there are more complex algorithms which have come up with better strategies for very simple games as well. And tit for tat is one. But as a philosophy or as a very simple strategy, tit for tat is the best cooperative strategy, which in a very simple terms means that if you're good to me, I'm good to you. If you're not, I'm not. And that's like most relationships can resolve conflict using just this strategy. A player using tit for tat chooses to cooperate by default and only defects as a direct response to the opponent defecting first, resulting in an appropriate eye for an eye moral response. After retaliating against the opponent's defection, the tit for tat player then switches back to their original cooperation strategy, giving their opponent the benefit of the doubt. Defection only becomes an option should the other person choose to defect again. I'll actually quickly share that video, or maybe after the session, I'll that Veritasm video, because in this case you can observe that in this specific tit for tat strategy, you also give the person benefit of the doubt. So even if they defect once, then you defect, but after that you are still biased to cooperating. So if they continue to cooperate, you cooperate. If they continue to defect, only then you defect. So your first response is always to cooperate, which actually I think in that Veritasm video, I'm not entirely sure, was the winning strategy for any decision making. So I think it's on a very human level. It's also, I think it's part of the same video that Setu shared last time. Yeah, I'll try to go over it again if it does not talk about that specific thing. But I think just to reiterate on my point, it just reinforces the point where longer term interactions will always benefit humans to cooperate with each other, because there is more to lose than to gain by defecting, because once you start defecting on a regular basis, then people will not be incentivized to cooperate with you. And this is like the economic subject as well, that we say that we study economics as students to understand how to maximize value, and individuals can do that alone because value is subjective. But through empirical history, through observation, everybody can come to that conclusion that cooperation and human knowledge sharing and exchange creates more value for everybody who is part of the game. And I think that this book discusses the couple of type of games. So game theory has two types of games. One is cooperative games and one is non-cooperative games. Cooperative games by default mean that you benefit from cooperation. And I think Bitcoin is like the perfect example for that Bitcoin is free and open source software. There is clearly a benefit for everybody contributing to Bitcoin to cooperate because the whole infrastructure is built on free and open source software. You can fork off, you can build your own Bitcoin, and you can try to create your own monetary system. It will only benefit when you are able to convey to the rest of the network that it is clearly better than Bitcoin. So nothing is stopping you from trying to create a copy of Bitcoin. It is entirely free and open source. So entire contribution to Bitcoin benefits from more and more people cooperating to understand how to make the system robust. Yeah, Dhruvil, thank you so much. Yeah, I think this video I've not watched it recently, but I think this covers the tit for tat strategy. That if it's pure tit for tat, every time you defect, I will defect. That's actually, there's some complex algorithm around how that's actually not the best case scenario. It's best to give the benefit of the doubt to the other player, and but also to have some mechanism where if they continue to defect 2 or 3 times, then the player then never cooperates. Yeah, so there's some nuance around it, but as a very simple framework, we can look at it for tat as just the framework of cooperating as the first choice, but also being retaliatory when needed. I think this book now talks about this, that never retaliating is also not a good choice. So to be kind and forgiving is important, but also to be able to spot when somebody is not cooperating and retaliate on that. The tactic embodies simplicity and reciprocity and relates to cooperation and retaliation in politics, international relations, and even evolutionary biology. Yeah. So as we discussed, I think so it's debatable whether Bitcoin is political or not. I think the best way to call it is apolitical, because it is neutral to anybody doing anything, as long as you can preserve the full nodes and the property rights of running Bitcoin core on your systems. Then Bitcoin is completely apolitical. There's nothing to do with any politics. But what it does, it creates a monetary system which is disrupting the flawed monetary system that we live in. And whether or not that is a political idea, that's like open semantics. but it gives the power to an individual to have complete control over their own money over and also the say over the global monetary policy that is Bitcoin. International relations and even evolutionary biology. If you remember last time we discussed that catalactic competition is part of human behavior, which is part of evolutionary biology. So even if somebody is not a biologist, they can already understand that uh, humans also benefit from getting resources by force. And the current model that we live in the structure of society is that inflation and taxes are part of the most humans are not uh, do not have a say over the Fed's cut rates, the Fed's monetary policy, and even the taxation policy that most of us are just forced to comply with. Axelrod's findings emphasize the importance of being friendly and forgiving, but also appropriately retaliatory. Yeah, this is the tit for tat part, that you also need to be retaliatory when the other person is not cooperating. In Theodore Roosevelt's words, speak softly and carry a big stick. These principles underscore the complex dynamics of cooperation and conflict resolution, regardless of whether we are discussing anthills or nuclear warhead management. Ultimately, this evolution of collaboration, even among self centered individuals, highlights that it is in one's best long term interest to be honest rather than try to deceive whichever opponent you happen to face. Yep, yep. Just take a quick pause. I shared some of my ramblings as well in case somebody has anything to share. Always feel free to give your opinions, thoughts, and ask questions. Yeah. Yeah, one of the insights is that human behavior is not too different from any other species on the planet. Everybody already understands it at some or the other level, but I think it's interesting to just see that even ants are cooperating to create more complex systems than one ant can even possibly conceive of. And this is the opportunity that humans always have, that by cooperation we can create systems and value which somebody alone can never create. I'll continue reading. The final scene in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight depicts our innate proclivity for non aggression. As the scene unfolds, the Joker has trapped two distinct segments of Gotham's population on two ferries. One ferry is full of innocent people, and the other carries the city's worst criminals. The Joker then tells them he intends to blow up both ferries at midnight unless one ferry chooses to blow up the other first. Both ferries are given a detonator device that the Joker claims will blow up the other ferry. The scene ends with the criminals throwing the detonator out a window, and although the civilians vote to blow up the criminals, when push comes to shove, the ferry captain can't bring himself to pull the trigger.
Hey, can
Yeah.
you reread whatever is highlighted once? I missed
Yes.
the initial part. Thanks.
Yes. The final scene in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight depicts our innate proclivity for non aggression. As the scene unfolds, the Joker has trapped two distinct segments of Gotham's population on two ferries. One ferry is full of innocent people, and the other carries the city's worst criminals. The Joker then tells them he intends to blow up both ferries at midnight, unless one ferry chooses to blow up the other first. Both ferries are given a detonator device that the Joker claims will blow up the other ferry. The scene ends with the criminals throwing the detonator out a window, and although the civilians vote to blow up the criminals, when push comes to shove, the ferry captain can't bring himself to pull the trigger. Yeah. So if any of you has not watched The Dark Knight, I'll just quickly give the dilemma that the Joker in the movie creates. And Joker is this psychotic personality, which I think in the movie symbolizes that he has no agenda. He has no specific purpose to achieving certain outcome, other than perhaps making a statement that the civilized society that sometimes we just take for granted is not as civilized. So I don't know if there is a Bitcoin message there or not, but the movie's point, or at least my or one of the popular interpretations of that movie, is that Joker creates that very explicitly, that dilemma of whether humans are going to choose aggression or not. And very interestingly, the movie proves that humans actually choose to not be aggressive. And even though the choice on a moral level was very clear on one of those ferries, that the other ferry only has criminals, so they don't have any moral dilemma of whether they are killing innocent people. They are clearly killing people who are not innocent or who have committed crimes. but they choose to not do that. So this is just the it's fictional, but yeah, it's just giving um, some framework of making decisions on morality and human cooperation. Batman's stories are allegedly fictional. There are many real world examples where people abstain from casting the first stone. The rationale for this behavior can be derived from the simple logic of which personality traits provided an evolutionary advantage throughout the history of life on this planet. No species would have gotten very far without cooperation. Yep. Yeah, so yeah, on a very anthropological level, I think humans are clearly one of the physically weakest species, but we clearly are the best species. We can debate whether or not any different laws apply to us. I don't think they do. I think every species is like smelling incentives and acting on them, and humans act very similarly. That we act on incentives. Those incentives are born out of value systems that we choose. This is like the explicit choice we make that this is the value system that I have, and then I get incentivized to act a certain way. But the the biggest advantage that we had was to cooperate, and that's how humans have been able to conquer at least other species, if not nature itself. Speaking of bats, the mutual nurturing behavior of vampire bats highlights the tit for tat tactic in nature. Uh, These bats often share blood meals with fellow hungry bats because they know the favor will be returned in future. Reciprocal altruism ensures that bats who share their resources will receive help when needed, encouraging cooperation and social cohesion within the group. Yeah, so I think I was highlighting instead of ants, it's actually bats. That this book gives an example that even bats engage in cooperation and to a certain degree low time preference behavior. I think humans have the advantage of thinking in terms of decades and years and sometimes centuries. So we have the ability to build systems and cooperation strategies which span times much beyond even an average human life. So yeah, this is the advantage that I, other than cooperation, maybe to also be anticipating value and future beyond what other species can think of. Yeah, just one quick pause here. Yep. Yeah, I'll start reading from here. The BitTorrent network, a peer-to-peer file sharing protocol, is an example of tit for tat from the internet. The network's users enhance their download speeds by employing a cooperation or defection tit for tat strategy, which is necessary since BitTorrent peers have a finite number of upload slots to share with others. When a peer's upload bandwidth reaches its limits, it adopts tit for tat to prioritize cooperative peers, those who exchange upload bandwidth for download bandwidth. If a peer does not reciprocate by uploading, the BitTorrent software restricts its connection until the uncooperative peer begins uploading again. Yeah, this is like tit for strategy at play, where BitTorrent peers are incentivized to cooperate with those peers who are cooperating and sharing information and sharing resources, which is bandwidth and upload bandwidth and download bandwidth in this case. Axelrod's Prisoner's Dilemma tournament underscores a fundamental truth: the balance between self-interest and cooperative behavior is crucial in the game of life, where decisions shapes futures. This balance, encoded in our very nature, demonstrates the impact of strategic choices on our individual and collective destinies. Empirical evidence suggests that, more often than not, the best long-term strategy is to be cooperative. Yeah, I think yeah, just one point on how all of our decisions have impact on our individual and also collective destinies. So sometimes when some people ask whether Bitcoin will succeed or not, I think that's a little flawed question because it depends on us, right? It depends on the people in present who are valuing. Even if you're not working on Bitcoin, you are making choices to have certain value systems, and they can be detrimental to the value systems of others, and they cannot be. If they are not, then you are pro freedom. I think that you are pro Bitcoin already, even if you're not holding Bitcoin or buying them or working on it. But yeah, I think the question of whether or not Bitcoin succeeds or not is more of on us. It's like on humanity and all of us individually to the best of our abilities, verify how Bitcoin works and contribute to it becoming more robust.
Just to add to that, I mean, you rightly mentioned that, I mean, a lot of people ask whether Bitcoin will succeed or Bitcoin will fail. And it primarily depends upon the people who are participating in Bitcoin, right? If they act as honest participants, then Bitcoin will prosper and flourish. If they act in their own self-interest and harm Bitcoin, then Bitcoin will perish. And at the same time, I hear a lot of people also say things like, Bitcoin is incorruptible. Bitcoin cannot be corrupted at all, or Bitcoin's 21 million cap cannot be changed at all, or Bitcoin's consensus rules are cannot be changed at all. Some people believe that Bitcoin's success is guaranteed and Bitcoin is absolutely infallible. And this is a very common phenomenon that I see in a lot of people, that they believe that Bitcoin is infallible, Bitcoin is uncorruptible, and Bitcoin's success is absolutely taken for granted and guaranteed, which I completely disagree with. Bitcoin success is not guaranteed. Bitcoin is absolutely corruptible, and Bitcoin can absolutely fail. So it depends upon the participants of the network. If they work towards the interests of Bitcoin, then Bitcoin will succeed. And if they do not work towards the interest of Bitcoin, if they do not protect it, if they do not play by the rules, then it is absolutely possible for Bitcoin to fail.
Yeah, 100%. Those are great points. I also think, just to add one example, I recently had a conversation with my sister, and I think all of you must have also heard this, that some people say that the American Constitution was written by visionaries because it's the best document that humanity has come up with in terms of social cooperation and decision making. I think that's not true, because Bitcoin is actually allowing every individual who has an internet connection and some basic hardware requirements, that's the only cost to participate in Bitcoin, to verify the rules of the network and to contribute to it. So yeah, I think, yeah, that's very true, that every piece of document which writes rules has failed, because even American Constitution is currently failing right before our eyes. So Bitcoin is writing the rules of human cooperation, which is money. So it depends on humans to actively defend it. Yep. Okay. Thank you for sharing your points. If no other questions, comments, I'll continue reading. As we navigate life's complex web of interactions, the wisdom from game theory to be kind, forgiving, firm in response, and transparent guides us towards a more harmonious coexistence. We are wired to optimize individual outcomes, and in doing so, contribute to a more cooperative and peaceful world. Is there a more comforting thought than knowing that being kind and just is just how you beat the game of evolution? Also embedded in the web of interactions is the concept that the more willing you are to delay gratification, the more likely you are to play the game correctly, which benefits everyone. In the end, consensual cooperation not only prevails but saves us all. All that's required for this timeline to play out is kindness and appropriate responses to injustices. The former is easy, but the latter can be tricky. Appropriate responses require you to know your enemy. Unfortunately, many bad actors are good at hiding their true intentions and have considerable political power. Yeah, I think this paragraph is where the things start to get interesting in this book, and also just as a, I think, to the point of Faisal that he raised as well, that Bitcoin is actively being attacked because there is enough incentive for a lot of people to attack Bitcoin, and yeah, in that case, our responsibility as people who call themselves Bitcoiners will be to make those choices to ensure that Bitcoin works in the way that it is adding value to humanity. I won't go as far. I think the best way is to maybe call it censorship resistant money, preserving the properties of censorship resistance. I think fixed supply is just the definition of Bitcoin. So I personally just call it censorship resistant money. Fixed supply is just, it's like, that is Bitcoin. If we don't have fixed supply, then why are we even trying to buy this thing or value this thing or work on this thing? But the core property is censorship resistant. Whether that means somebody should be able to verify the rules of the network as an individual, or somebody should be able to include their transaction without necessarily revealing their personally identifiable information. And yeah, just one point I also wanted to highlight is about delayed gratification. I think this is like a uniquely human quality, and this goes into cooperation as well. When you're able to delay gratification, you have more incentive to cooperate. because you are not hungry for any specific resources in that moment. So you have more incentive to cooperate with more people with more abilities, and so on and so forth. Our brains are hardwired to react more strongly to threats and bad news than to positive information. A newspaper with headlines like "Everyone lives longer now" or "Crime rates are dropping" wouldn't sell many copies. Fear sells, which is something both journalists and politicians are aware of. There is nothing new, of course, and the way human hierarchical power structures are set up is largely a product of our leaders' ability to play on these fears and gain popular support by exaggerating both the alleged problems and the efficiency of their supposed solutions. In many, if not most cases, our societies would have been better off by not caring so much. Yeah. I think this just goes without saying that almost too obvious and true at this point in history, at least, that politicians are just fear mongers, and their strategies is just to make people act on panic and fear and not apply rational thinking. Democratic systems, for example, are not as consensual as advertised. Modern nation states depend on mandatory public schooling, taxation, and central banking. These systems have only been around for a few hundred years, yet they pervade our society so intensely. It's as if we have never been without them. Citizens can vote for political parties that promise to lower one tax or scrap another, but inflation ensures that taxes always trend upward. Furthermore, a public institution behaves like any other type of tumor. It grows and grows, and the only way to stop the process is to remove it altogether. Now, on one point of just adding one anecdote on this point of inflation ensuring that taxes always trend upward, is that even in the current financialization of Bitcoin that is happening with BlackRock ETF, I think their incentive is very clear to treat Bitcoin as an asset so that they can include it within their closed systems and apply same regulations on it as any other asset is treated, and so that they can apply capital gains tax on it and incentivize people to never opt out of that closed system, because in the current system assets um, are it's in the incentive, or at least in the short term incentive of people to hold assets with the regulated custodians, because there are tax benefits to be had. So yeah, just adding on the point where inflation is not only devaluing our money, but it actively um, creates assets and financialization of those assets and not allow them to be used in a free market economy as money. Whether that's something outside of Bitcoin as well, whether that's gold or any security as well. And any public institution behaves like any other type of humor, it grows and grows, and the only way to stop the process is to remove it altogether. Reconfiguring society presents a Sisyphean task. Public schooling and state subsidized media feed the democracy narrative, and most people think societal problems are most efficiently solved, via the ballot box. Politicians faced with re-election can't resist promising fancy goodies to potential voters, and someone has to pay eventually. If it's not through taxes, it's through inflationary currency enabled by central banks. And there is no way to entirely opt out of the fiat system as long as governments require taxes paid in their national currencies. The most insidious thing is that inflation is a sneakily gradual process. The frog in the boiling pot doesn't jump out since he doesn't realize he's being cooked alive. He will keep voting for more heat. The long arm of the law allows the eager fingers of the taxman and the central banker to pickpocket you without you even noticing the hidden threat of violence backing up these actions. Refuse to pay, and you'll soon find out what this means. You have been lulled into thinking that some non consensual interactions are morally okay through decades of programming by public schooling and mainstream media outlets, financed and subsidized by the pickpockets themselves. But taxes, and especially inflation, are neither natural nor moral phenomena. Like everything else in society, they are the products of deliberate decisions. Just to summarize these two paragraphs, I think, yeah, if most of you would have heard of the saying that you might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. So the current structures of institutions, I think the word institution also just means that, so institution differs from companies or corporations because institutions means that they exist. You don't have a choice in them not existing. So they are not a free market phenomena, right? Because two competing institutions become just two market players, and whoever provides better service, better value will eventually win. But um, in the current society, it's not an option to opt out of certain institutions. So yeah, so they force you to act in certain ways, which sometimes some people think that they are necessary or consensual, but they're not. If the game you're playing is rigged such that you cannot retaliate appropriately when you're being deceived, your only option is to find a better game. Yep. So yeah, like we were discussing in the context of having retaliation always as a toolkit, and in tit for tat, it's like that's the basic framework of human cooperation. If you're good to me, I'm good to you. If you're not, then I am not. But in the process where some institutions do not allow you the option of retaliation, it's like you don't have an option of not cooperating with them, which here means not getting influenced by their decision making. You don't have the option to retaliate. So what happens in that scenario? The only option is to find a better game. A game where the cost of deceit dwarfs the potential temporary gain to such an extent that cheating becomes a pointless endeavor. Right. Hope this was explanatory that yeah, cost of deceit dwarfs the potential temporary gain to such an extent that cheating becomes a pointless endeavor. And this is where Note put it brilliantly in the session that he joined, that he defines Bitcoin as the rule set which is expensive to be broken, because any rule set is just some human giving directions, but people people who are working on Bitcoin have one rule set that they create and they verify, and they make it expensive for anybody to try to break those rules. This on a technical level means that anybody who's trying to recreate the ledger, which is the blockchain, they will have to redo the work from a certain block height to be able to claim that new transactions need to be added, or to spend the inputs that they have previously spent. In our day and age, there is only one such game in town, Bitcoin. Bitcoin provides each and every one of us with a crucial choice, the choice to opt out of unfair games. To understand Bitcoin properly, specifically what problem it solves, we must first understand human action. Like mathematics and game theory, the science of human action is not empirical. Therefore, the underlying axioms praxeology is built upon cannot be refuted without running into logical contradictions. For example, the statement every voluntary exchange is perceived as beneficial by both parties involved, lest the exchange will not happen, cannot be refuted without inconsistencies. If either party didn't find it beneficial, the exchange could still happen, but it wouldn't be voluntary. Yeah, so praxeology, I think in the last session I said that it's very close to economics. I take that back. I was wrong, because praxeology is literally what Austrian School of Economics is built upon. And praxeology studies human action, and the only axiom that it takes is that human action is purposeful behavior. And when somebody tries to refute that, somebody says that human action is not purposeful behavior, they are running into a logical contradiction, because their purpose is to contradict that. Or that's how at least I articulate the axiom of praxeology or Austrian economics. And yeah, so that gives us a good framework to build the value system of the free market, which is based off exchanges of humans, which is consensual and voluntary. By the same token, the statements an increase in the supply of a currency higher than the increase in the corresponding goods and services you can buy for that currency can never lead to lower prices. Or indeed, a coercive exchange may be of short-term benefit to the coercer, but never to the coerced, are also logically consistent and thus irrefutable. Yeah. So yeah, by the same token, an increase in the supply of currency, uh, whenever it is increasing more in comparison to the existing goods and services in the economy, it will of course lead to higher prices, whether that's immediate or there is some time lag in that. Yeah, to me, just the point of supply increasing of money supply just automatically triggers a obvious point that it can never have value, because anything in this universe, for it to exist, for it to be valuable, there needs to be some work to be done for it to exist. So any unit of money which is created out of thin air, which is created with just a keystroke or just a paper being printed, has more value than the actual work than there was put behind that activity. So it automatically defeats the entire purpose of money, because money is supposed to represent is designed to represent our labor and help us to store value for future. I'll take a pause here. We're about two-thirds into the session. I'll just quickly check. We might not be able to start the next chapter in this session. We'll see if we are able to do that. Okay, I'll continue reading.
Is the chapter about to be over? If
Yes.
not, it's okay. We can take 10-15 more minutes and cover whatever we can cover.
Right. No, we will be able to cover this chapter for sure. I think it's also good that this chapter definitely required at least a couple of sessions. And the next chapter is on the political philosophy of wokeism and the existing political framework of the world. So yeah, maybe we can introduce it. We'll see how much time we have. Yeah, I'll continue reading. These statements don't have to be shown to be accurate by observation, but are irrefutable logical conclusions. As Voltaire bemoaned, common sense is not very common. Most people view threats, deceit, and coercion as natural phenomena, something we all just have to accept and live with. Democracy is still the least form of governance there is, right? Few understand the implications of such acceptance, and even fewer know that alternative modus operandi exist. Right. So we'll get into the more nuanced and interesting discussions around democracy in the next chapter as well. But just one point that I think I want to make is regarding threats, deceit, and coercion. As natural phenomena, I think everybody, when you pinch them or when you take away their coffee or whatever, they immediately wouldn't just would never want to talk to you, right? Because you're clearly being an asshole. But for some reason, most people, when you try to communicate to them that the supply of money is increasing or there is double taxation in a lot of economic activity, then they don't necessarily look at it as the same phenomena. It's also important to note that voluntary is not the same as consensual. For example, a person being robbed might voluntarily give up his Rolex watch in exchange for his life without necessarily consenting to the interaction. The same is true for most taxpayers. Taxes are, for the most part, voluntarily paid because the taxpayer finds paying them a better option than jail. This does not make them consensual. In fact, the government calling you a taxpayer is a bit like a rapist calling his victim his girlfriend. Many a word has been written about the benefits of free market system, the history of money, and the horrors of totalitarianism. However, most people are still clueless about how horrendous the butterfly effects can be following even the slightest politicization of the free market process. In a world where correct pronoun assignments, teenaged weather activists, the big game last night, Taylor Swift's latest boyfriend, and a mostly harmless flu are headline news, it's easy to see that some force is trying to avert our eyes from the men behind the curtain. But what force can these men behind said curtain in the first place? What force put these men behind the said curtain in the first place? And what can be done to reverse the process? Right. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that most people did not know anything about the central banking system before they either went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole or Austrian economics rabbit hole or questioning some deeper questions about society. So clearly, there are big institutions and people in power who were behind them because they were deliberately put there. The two towering figures of the Austrian School of Economics, Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, described the state's rapacious nature similarly to the examples above, yet they were critical of the applicability and relevance of game theory to economics. So you'll find almost complete agreement of Austrian economists school of thought with how game theory works in terms of just human decision making and how Bitcoin works, for example. So Austrian school advocates for money, which is the most saleable exchange, and that is decided through the process of free market. So Bitcoin is exactly that of a free market process of individuals valuing Bitcoin. There is no coercive authority ever forcing you to use Bitcoin, but they are still critical of the applicability and relevance of game theory to economics. They both argued that praxeology's methodological and philosophical foundations differ from those underpinning game theory. Though not extensively discussing game theory directly in his works, Mises laid the framework of praxeology, which emphasizes individual decision making based on subjective values and preferences. From a Misesian perspective, economics should focus on understanding individuals' purposeful actions rather than mathematical models or predictive systems like those often employed in game theory. Mises critiqued game theory for its reliance on mathematical abstraction and for its assumptions of fixed preferences and information symmetry among participants. He argued that such models can only partially capture human actions' dynamic and subjective nature, which is crucial to economic analysis. Right. In my understanding of game theory so far, the this point of me is criticizing it of having fixed preferences and information symmetry. I think this is where information symmetry means that we assume that the participants in game theory have the same information about decision making, or if not same information, at least all information that goes into decision making, and they have fixed preferences. So this is the rational. This is just my interpretation, by the way. So please don't uh, hold this to hold this against me with a gun. That game theory supposes that every human is a rational human being with self-interest as his primary optimization, which the primary goal of his, which like is like the axiom. If we can debate whether that's true or not, but that I think sometimes runs in contradiction to Mises' understanding of economics, which is purely human, individual, subjective evaluation, which I think just pins down valuation for that individual. It just means that every individual who has ever lived gets to define what value is to them, and there is no generalization that we can do other than just saying that value is subjective. Rothbard offered even more direct critiques of game theory. Acknowledging the intellectual allure of game theory, Rothbard criticized its practical utility in economic analysis. Given game theory's focus on static equilibria and defined payoff matrices, Rothbard was particularly skeptical of its capacity to provide meaningful insights into market processes and the actions of entrepreneurs. I don't think I know anything about static equilibria and defined payoff matrices, which I think are game theory's concepts. But yeah, I think we discussed market processes and actions of entrepreneurs when we read How to Think About the Economy. And I'll just give the overview of what they mean. So, market processes is just the process of humans engage in exchange to maximize value. So, the definition or the axiom of market means that it is a process. This is how Austin Economics defines it. That market is a process. So, every time you wake up, you make decisions about what to do and where to go and how to do it. You are in the process of creating value for yourself, and you take purposeful action to that end. And when two people get together, it's already an interaction. You're already part of the market process. And then through those exchanges of information, value, goods, and services, you create the free market that we study. And entrepreneurs, in the definition of Austin Economics, is somebody who is anticipating value for the future. And I think just one example that helps me put a framework is that businesses or businessmen are people who are catering to the existing demand. That somebody wants something that you can produce, so you produce that and you give that in exchange for profit, in exchange for money. Entrepreneurs, on the other hand, are somebody who are people who are anticipating value, who are anticipating human behavior or human values, which might or might not be true. It can still be true in the present, and it's just about finding the person who is having that value, who values exchanging their goods or services and time with you. But entrepreneurs differ from businesses, or at least they are a separate word or phenomena concept, because they are people who anticipate value in the market process, and they can be wrong, they can be right, and that's the experimentation process of the free market. I'll take a quick 30-second or 15-second pause quickly in the chat as well. I'll continue reading. One should, of course, refrain from drawing unfounded conclusions about economics and human choices. The Austrian economists were right to leave mathematics out of economics because subjective value judgments cannot be quantified. If, however, we maintain separation between these two sciences and admit that they describe vastly different things, they can provide us with better truth goggles through which to view the world. So yeah, in a very simple sense, there is value to be had in studying both the disciplines, and we have to look at them separately and not necessarily confuse them with with the same analysis of the same methods. So back to Axelrod, what a lovely name for a mathematician, don't you think? His findings did not come from a priori deductive reasoning, but from simply testing various strategies against one another and observing the results. To what extent repeated, relatively simple game theoretical games accurately represent world events, real world events, is thus impossible to know. Empiricism does not allow for irrefutable claims like a priori deductive reasoning does. What it can do, though, is provide tools to make your view of history increasingly accurate. So, empiricism means studying reality from history. That you do more and more things, you collect more and more data, and you start to observe patterns in that data. And this is the model of study. So, this is how any scientific endeavor attempts to study reality, whether that's physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and game theory, that you conduct certain experiments, you collect data on it, and as you start to see things happening more and more, you start to sense a pattern. And that could be something as profound as gravity. That gravity clearly is a very, on an intuitive level, seems something like a force. But I think, and I am just a noob at physics, so please don't again hold a gun against me for this. But Newton did the discovery of gravity as a force, but Einstein was able to refute that, of understanding gravity as the curvature of space and time. So I think something like gravity is a good example for understanding empiricism, that even though in Einstein's framework, and Einstein's framework is the modern version of how we study gravity, might it's not important. It still does not refute Newton's claims, because gravity, in the sense that humans care about, which is on a very daily basis, because gravity does not act on subatomic particles, and most humans don't care about studying parallel universes. Then empiricism is still an amazing model at studying gravity, because Newton also discovered gravity less than 500 years ago, and humans had no prior understanding of gravity, at least as a mathematical model. So empiricism definitely does has its value, and of course, I mean, that goes without saying, but it does not allow for irrefutable claims. You can always refute anything, as Einstein did for Newton's work on gravity. Compared to a priori deductive reasoning, which comes from first principle thinking of defining something and then coming to consensus on that deductive reasoning, that cannot be broken down. And praxeology, or Austrian economics, chooses that to be human action as purposeful behavior. There is no loophole, or there is nothing that you can create that refutes that reasoning. Yeah, I don't know if a priori deductive reasoning applies to anything else. I think the closest that I can think of is just human language, that we choose certain symbols to have certain sounds, and then we use those certain sounds to communicate certain things, which is the alphabet. And yeah, in that you can't refute that, because A just means A. So you can't build an argument for why A should not be A. Yep. We have reached the last page of this chapter. It's important not to throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to empiricism. One of humanity's best ideas, the scientific method, arguably propelled our species forward more during the Enlightenment than any preceding era. Sorry. Game theory and praxeology are both about understanding incentives and their roles in our interactions, but the things they describe and how they describe them differ vastly. Right, they are both about understanding incentives and their roles in our interactions, but the things they describe and how they describe them differ vastly. Yeah, so it's best to, if nothing else resonates, then this is the fact that we have to look at them as separate studies, separate sciences, which ultimately studies human behavior but do it very differently. Methodologically, they are similar, as both rely on axiomatic logical deduction. Game theory studies mathematical models of strategic interactions among rational agents, while praxeology studies purposeful action per se. A deeper understanding of both subjects can inject a healthy dose of optimism into an otherwise bleak world. At the end of the day, our actions dictate our future. Game theory can tell us about the probable outcome of a particular strategy, but without our individual deliberate actions, there can be no strategy at all. You decide how you want to play whatever game you choose to participate in. You decide when to give the benefit of the doubt and when to retaliate. No one can decide these things but you. What reality you end up in depends on your choices, regardless of when or where you happen to be born. Accepting this is a good starting point in the perpetual quest for freedom, which we all have to partake in sooner or later, whether we know it or not. Yeah, this last few lines are, I think, just for every individual to just think on their own and understand on their own. I'll just read this one time, and then we have about 5 minutes, and we'll give an introduction to the next chapter. I'll read from here. At the end of the day, our actions dictate our future. Game theory can tell us about the most probable outcome of a particular strategy, but without our individual deliberate actions, there can be no strategy at all. You decide how you want to play whatever game you choose to participate in. You decide when to give the benefit of the doubt and when to retaliate. No one can decide these things but you. What reality you end up in depends on your choices, regardless of when or where you happen to be born. Accepting this is a good starting point in the perpetual quest for freedom, which we all have to partake in sooner or later, whether we know it or not. And I think this is important because this paragraph's last line is very important in the context of Bitcoin, that a deeper understandings of any endeavor to study human action will inject a healthy dose of optimism, because Bitcoin always represents the choice to participate in a system which has been fair from day one. Quote unquote fair, I think, has sometimes become a politically loaded word, but to the extent that that word is just a word, Bitcoin was always fair because Satoshi released it, and everybody was free to join the network whenever they wanted to. So yeah, and Bitcoin represents the ability to store money, send money without permission, and verify the rules of the network as well. So yeah, this is just the time in history where understanding human incentives is at the best time, because yeah, no matter where you were born or where you start off, you always have the option of participating in the network, which no other money allows you to do. I'll take a pause here. We have about 3 minutes left. I'll just read the first page of this chapter, and we'll call it a day.
Just one question. Like, what was the name of the first chapter?
Incentives.
Incentives. Okay.
Yeah, I think this book is neatly divided a lot of the concepts in the chapters. So I think, yeah, having that as the title, to just build a framework when we summarize this book over time. I think incentives is a I look at incentive is a very, it's almost like a fragrance that every species, whether or not they have rational minds, do act on incentives, because ants or bats or any microbes always act on incentives. All of us, all species, all life on earth is acting on incentives because they are trying to maximize value in their own ways. For humans, incentives is more complex, or at least for us it is complex. I don't know if ants find us interesting, but for us it is complex because humans are complex. Otherwise, we wouldn't be living in a weird slavery system. Okay, I'll just read this first page and then we'll close off tonight. And I think I mentioned this before. This chapter has a lot of anecdote and a lot of things that we can go into, but it depends on whatever you guys also find interesting. Wokeism. In the cloak and dagger world of Cold War espionage, one man's crisis of conscience proved more potent than the propaganda machine he once served. Yuri Bezmenov, born in 1939 in the Soviet Moscow suburb of Mytishchi, has been trained as a master of deception by the notorious KGB. After cutting his teeth, spreading disinformation with the press arm of the Soviet army, Bezmenov went to work for the Novosti press agency in 1963, all while moonlighting as an informant for the KGB itself. But after over a decade of disseminating lies on an industrial scale, Bezmenov made the ultimate defection, abandoning the rotten core of the Soviet system he could no longer tolerate. His daring escape to the West in 1970 put his life in the crosshairs, leading him to assume a new identity as Thomas David Schumann in Canada. Yet this was only the beginning of the high-stakes journey for the disillusioned agent, determined to expose the sinister machinery of subversion where he had once thrived. I'll summarize this. I'll also just share the link of his lecture that I was watching. So just to summarize so he's a agent of the KGB that was eventually he eventually found an escape to the United States, and he has, at least from what I have read about him so far, he has leaked how KGB actively created the subversion system, that, as he calls it, of the modern day political structures. And that subversion, as it might sound very physical or very dangerous, but it's actually very subtle and very slow. This chapter now will go into that. But if somebody's interested, they can watch this lecture as well. He goes into the details of how KGB conducted, and he actually talks a lot about how people imagine it to be blowing up bridges and James Bond and just espionage of some agent coming through without and acting as somebody else. But it's a lot more subtle. It's a lot more insidious in ways which even I am new to, so I can't necessarily share a lot of insights. But yeah, just something that I found interesting.
I think his video is worth watching.
Yeah, I definitely like his talking style as well. So he's an interesting person. I just watched this lecture so far, but I saw on YouTube that he has a lot of lectures and a lot of stories, because clearly he's lived a very interesting.
There's a video of Bezmenov talking about ideological subversion and what's the process like. And
Right.
I just like it. It's astonishing that Soviet Union got independent in 1970 or something, sometime, no? And
Yes.
they had all these concepts, ideological subversion and propaganda, ministry of all that, which is very strange
Yes.
for a country just 20 years independent doing all of this kind of stuff.
True. And I also think he talks about how they referred a Chinese philosopher, I can't remember the name right now, who has written on the art of war, of how choosing physical violence is the most idiotic thing that somebody can do in warfare. And he lists and creates a whole framework of... Sorry?
Are you talking about Sun Tzu?
Yeah, maybe Sun Tzu. Yeah, he talks about him in the lecture. And he talks about how KGB created this whole vision. So you have to give it to them in terms of a lower time preference for sure, of destabilizing the US as a polity, as a society, as a generation, and created a 20-year roadmap. And yeah, so this lecture was in 90s, and he said that this was already happening in the 90s, but I think now in the 21st century and 2020s, it is becoming more and more clear that it is happening right.
Do you want to play that for everyone's benefit? Bezmenov ideological subversion YouTube video.
Okay, I can play maybe for 1 or 2 minutes, and then yeah.
Yeah, you can. And we can probably continue those who want to hang out.
Yes.